They've always been there. That's the official line now. Female custodians, always present, somehow unrecorded across 4 decades of codices, novels, supplements, and lore entries, retroactively woven into the fabric of the 10,000, as though the omission was simply an oversight, a gap in depiction, rather than a deliberate and consistent architectural choice. Games Workshop put that framing into the world in 2024, and a specific kind of 40K fan immediately recognized what it was actually saying. Not because they resist change as a category, because they knew exactly which piece of structural engineering had just been quietly demolished behind the claim. And they knew it because they'd spent years understanding why it was there in the first place. So let's talk about what was actually always there. Because the Custodians aren't interesting because of their kill count or their gilded plate. They're interesting because of a single relationship that no other faction in Warhammer 40,000 possesses, and because of what happens to 10,000 warriors across 10,000 years when that relationship becomes irretrievably impossible. Every faction in the 41st millennium sees the Emperor of Mankind as something. The Space Marines see a distant father who shaped them from raw adolescent flesh, a patriarch who set them loose across the galaxy in service of a plan he never fully explained to them. The Imperial Guard bleeds and dies for a divine icon on a banner, a sacred flame so remote that most guardsmen will never understand what they're actually dying for beyond the abstract weight of the Imperium itself. The Ecclesiarchy built a religion around his golden image, a religion he explicitly didn't want, built on a body that can't object. The Inquisition enforces laws in the name of an institution he never intended. Even the Primarchs, his own engineered sons, the 20 most powerful military commanders humanity has ever produced, related to him through the distorting lens of filial expectation, of sons who needed a father who was always occupied with something immeasurably larger than any of them. The Custodians see a friend, not a god, not a symbol, not a commander issuing instructions down a chain of institutional authority, a friend. The Black Library novel that comes closest to being the foundational text of this faction, Valdor, Birth of the Imperium, written by Chris Raitt and published in 2020, describes Constantine Valdor, the Captain General of the Custodians during the Great Crusade, as the chief of the Emperor's Custodian Guard and among the closest of his companions. That language is in the product description because it's the central premise of the book. Not servants, not instruments, companions, closest companions. That single distinction, not servant, not worshipper, but companion, is the load-bearing column beneath everything the Custodes are, everything they sacrifice, and everything they fail to prevent. And to understand how the 2024 retcon dismantles that column, you first have to understand how carefully it was built. The Emperor of Mankind creates his custodians personally. That's the first and most consequential distinction from every other military force he fields. And it matters in a way that isn't immediately obvious. Space Marines are produced through a process involving Primarch gene seed. The Emperor designs the system, but the Primarchs serve as the biological intermediaries. Their genetic material is the template from which the Astartes are constructed. There's a layer of mediation between the Emperor and his soldiers. He's the architect, but the foundation is someone else's genetics, someone else's nature. A Space Marine is shaped by his Primarch's character at the cellular level. His loyalty runs through that Primarch before it reaches the Emperor. The emotional distance this creates isn't accidental. The Custodians have no such layer. Every modification, every tier of transformation that produces a Custodian passes directly through the Emperor's own knowledge and personal attention. He doesn't delegate. The academic analysis of the 40,000 setting produced by the University of Osijek's Religious Studies program notes that the Adeptus Custodes were maintained as his personal guards separately and distinctly even after the creation of the Adeptus Astartes. Not superseded by the more numerous Space Marines, but preserved as an older, more intimate institution operating on different principles entirely. The selection process reflects those principles. The 8th edition standalone Adeptus Custodes Codex, the first dedicated rulebook the faction ever received, describes the starting point in explicit terms. All custodians begin their lives as the infant sons of the noble houses of Terra. That language is precise in every dimension, not adolescents selected from garrison worlds scattered across the galaxy, as the Space Marine recruitment process broadly permits. Infants, from specific noble families of humanity's birth world. The transformation that follows is so total, operates across such a formative span of development, that what emerges shares almost nothing with the child who entered the process. He is remade from the foundational material upward, shaped by the Emperor's direct involvement across the entirety of his psychological and physical formation. Noble birth is a prerequisite, not a tradition or an affectation. The Emperor isn't selecting from the houses of Terra because of social convention or aristocratic sentiment. He's selecting for what noble birth produces in a child before the Emperor's involvement begins. The education, the classical formation, the depth of cultural and philosophical reference, the kind of raw material from which a genuine intellectual companion can eventually be constructed. A weapon can be forged from almost anything. A companion requires a foundation that was already there before the forging began, and that foundation has to be sophisticated enough to survive proximity to the most singular mind in human history without simply collapsing into awe. The Space Marines, for all their superhuman capability, are explicitly weapons given human form. The lore frames them as instruments, engineered to kill with terrifying efficiency, to follow orders, to advance and hold and die in the Emperor's name. They are extraordinary, and they are tools. A single custodian is described in various lore sources as a match for several Astartes in direct combat, but that comparison almost misses the point by measuring the wrong dimension. The Custodians aren't an upgraded Space Marine. They're a different category of creation serving a different purpose. Lore discussions across canonical and near-canonical sources consistently describe them not merely as bodyguards, but as advisors and companions. Broadly educated, philosophically capable, able to engage the Emperor as thinking equals in discourse and strategic analysis. That range is engineered into them not as a secondary feature, but as a design requirement, because a companion who can only discuss one subject isn't much of a companion for someone who has been thinking about the full breadth of human potential for 20,000 years. The Emperor's innermost circle within the 10,000 makes the relational intent explicit. The Lexicanum records them as the Heteron Guard, also known as the Companions, or the 300. They serve as the Emperor's personal attendants throughout the Great Crusade. The word heteron isn't accidental. It's a deliberate invocation of a historical institution that anyone with classical education would recognize, and naming it that way makes the Emperor's intent legible across the centuries, separating the Horus heresy from the present. In 334 BC, Alexander of Macedon crossed the Hellespont into Persian territory with approximately 37,000 infantry and a cavalry arm that included, at its elite core, the heteroi. History Hit's account of Macedonian cavalry records their composition precisely. Their riders came from the Macedonian nobility, and they were called the Companions. Alexander brought roughly 1,800 companions to Asia when the Persian campaign began. These weren't simply the best cavalry available. They were men who had grown up alongside Alexander in the Macedonian court, who had known him before the Persian campaign made him the most famous conqueror in the ancient world, who shared his table and his counsel and, occasionally, his rage. They were his intellectual peers and his social equals, men whose own noble formation gave them the standing to relate to Alexander as something other than supplicants in the presence of a king. The relationship was visibly different from the one he had with his infantry commanders. Alexander rode with the companions himself, leading their charges personally at Granicus in 334 BC, at Issus in 333 BC, at Gaugamela in 331 BC. He didn't send them forward from behind a command line. He was among them, which meant that in each engagement, the most strategically irreplaceable person in the Macedonian army was deliberately placing himself at the point of maximum physical risk alongside the men he trusted most. That's not a military calculation. That's a statement about the category of relationship involved. When his closest friend Hephaestion died in Ecbatana in 324 BC, Alexander's grief became a political event. He refused food. He ordered the manes and tails of all horses cut in mourning, a Greek custom typically reserved for the dead. He requested that the sacred flame at Ecbatana be extinguished, an honor previously given only to Persian kings. The funeral he arranged was on the scale of a royal burial. His army watched their commander collapse under personal grief in the middle of a campaign because the person who died wasn't a useful general whose position could be filled. It was the person who knew him. The grief of military calculation sounds different. This wasn't that. The hetairoi's significance was never purely military. Alexander had enormous infantry forces. He had war elephants. He had siege engineers. What the companions provided was something no military calculation could supply. People capable of knowing power as a human experience rather than an authority structure. Men whose own formation gave them the standing to hold a conversation with Alexander rather than simply receive instructions from him. People who could speak an uncomfortable truth and have it heard rather than punished. The emperor's heteron guard carries the identical institutional logic transplanted into transhuman flesh at galactic scale. Noble birth, personal selection from that background, the specific and deliberate purpose of surrounding the most singular intelligence in human history with people capable of knowing it as a person, not a divine symbol requiring reverence. The emperor looked at what Alexander built, or perhaps at what Alexander independently arrived at following the same logic, and constructed his version of it. 10,000 of them across the Great Crusade era, with the Heteron 300 as their innermost expression. Not a bodyguard, a community of the only people capable of relating to him without collapsing. This is also why the noble Terran birth requirement isn't just flavor text in the creation lore. It's the mechanism. The emperor selects from the noble houses because those families have already produced, in their infant children, the raw intellectual and cultural material the process needs to work with. Philosophy, rhetoric, classical learning, the kind of deep formation that comes from having access to the full breadth of human knowledge since childhood. These are the prerequisites. Remove the noble Terran origin requirement, and you can produce warriors. The Astartes demonstrate that. What you can't produce, without that specific foundation, is companions. The Custodians stop being a distinct category of creation and become, effectively, superior space marines. Exactly what 40 years of competitor coverage was already treating them as, to the frustration of the audience that came looking for something richer. Whether the Custodians worship the emperor as a god is a question the lore deliberately leaves unresolved. Some canonical sources say they don't treat him as a deity. He's their creator, their commander, the ultimate authority, but not the object of religious devotion in the sense the ecclesiarchy understands devotion. Others suggest the Custodians have always understood that his divine potential was real, that psychic transcendence on the scale he'd already achieved put him in a category that the word God might actually describe without exaggeration. A Custodian depicted in the Celestine audio drama admits he genuinely doesn't know where the line between man and God falls in the emperor's case. He's not hedging. He's being epistemically precise. The emperor is a psychic being of documented extraordinary power who has shaped human history for tens of thousands of years. At some point, the question, "Is this a god?" becomes genuinely hard to answer with confidence from where the Custodians stand. What the lore establishes consistently, and what carries the emotional weight of everything that follows, is more specific than any answer to that binary. The Custodians know the emperor as a person, not as a symbol, not as a distant authority, not as an abstraction worth dying for, as a person. They know what his projects look like when they're working and when they're failing. They know what he chooses to reveal and what he doesn't. They know his reasoning well enough to anticipate it, to serve as genuine advisors rather than sophisticated yes-men. The Valdor novel's framing of Valdor as among the closest of his companions is the canonical anchor, but the logic runs through everything the Custodes creation process is designed to produce. Space Marines don't have this. The Primarchs have something that superficially resembles it. They're his engineered sons, after all. But the Emperor-Primarch relationship is persistently complicated by the Emperor's opacity about the war he was actually fighting. Several Primarchs discovered critical truths about his plans after those plans had already run into catastrophe. Horus Lupercal, his most favored son, the War Master, the man he trusted above all others with military command of the Great Crusade, Horus was never told about chaos, never told what the Emperor was actually afraid of, what lay beyond the galaxy's edge, why the Imperial truth mattered in the specific way it mattered. The Emperor kept his deepest knowledge from his sons and told himself it was for their protection. He may have been right, but a relationship structured around strategic omission isn't the relationship between two people who know each other. It's something more painful and more estranged than that. The loneliness of a parent who can't explain to his children the actual danger they're in. The Custodians were made to know him, not to follow a symbol or serve an institution, but to know the specific man who built the institution, to understand his thinking closely enough to act as his counsel, to occupy his presence when there's no performance required. He built 10,000 of them. That number is worth holding. The Space Marine legions during the Great Crusade number in the hundreds of thousands across 20 formations. The 13th Legion Ultramarines alone fields over 250,000 warriors at peak strength. 10,000 Custodians don't shift a galactic war on force of numbers alone. 10,000 companions for one man is a statement about the depth of his isolation. He needed that many people capable of knowing him, and 10,000 still wasn't enough to change what he fundamentally was, the most alone person in human history. Before the 10,000. Before the Great Crusade and the formation of the Legio Custodes, before even the small beginning of only 4 guardians clad in crimson and gold, recorded in the earliest accounts of the Emperor's first steps toward unification, there was a prior army built by cruder methods for a purpose that couldn't be achieved by the Emperor's more refined creations. The Thunder Warriors. 20 regiments, organized as the Legiones Catogus, created for the specific task of unifying Terra across decades of the unification wars. The Custodians, as noted, are built from infancy through direct Imperial involvement, shaped across the full span of development. The Space Marines are created by implanting Primarch gene seed into selected adolescents, a process refined over years of biological research. The Thunder Warriors were made by applying alchemical augmentation, somatic gene sculpting, and muscle grafting techniques directly to adult males. The results were dramatic. Adults transformed into warriors of staggering physical capability on timelines the other processes couldn't approach. The unification wars needed soldiers now, not after decades of careful cultivation. The structural cost was intrinsic to the method. Adult physiology resists modifications at the cellular level. Modifications that a growing body would integrate over years of development instead trigger rejection responses in a completed adult form. The augmentations degraded over time. Metabolic collapse set in as the body fought the changes made to it. Mental instability followed the physical deterioration. The Thunder Warriors were functionally finite, built to perform at extraordinary capacity for a defined window, then to begin breaking down from the inside out, becoming more erratic, more dangerous, and less controllable as their own bodies rejected what had been done to them. This wasn't a flaw the Emperor discovered after the fact. The biological constraints of adult augmentation were understood before the first Thunder Warrior was made. He built warriors with an expiration date because he needed warriors immediately, and the biological cost of that timeline was something his soldiers would pay personally rather than something his plans would absorb. He created a generation of loyal fighters with a structural guarantee of eventual deterioration, and he used the deterioration when the time came. They fought for him anyway. Across the decades of the Unification Wars, the Thunder Warriors broke fortress cities, shattered warlord armies, bled across Terra in the Emperor's name. Many of them were genuinely and deeply loyal, soldiers who understood they'd been built for a purpose and who committed themselves to that purpose without demanding more from the arrangement. They were his before the Custodians were his, in the sense of being the first forces to organize their lives and their deaths entirely around his vision of a unified humanity. In 669 M30, the last major battle of the Unification Wars was fought at Mount Ararat, in what the lore records as the Kingdom of Urartu. The Thunder Warriors assembled for what would be described in the official imperial record as a final, glorious engagement. Constantine Valdor arrived leading a cadre of several hundred custodians, accompanied by the first Astartes of the nascent Space Marine legions. The Thunder Warriors weren't there to face an external enemy. They were the target. The Emperor had ordered his newest forces to destroy his oldest ones. The Warhammer 40,000 wiki records what happened between Valdor and the Thunder Warrior leader, Ushotin. Ushotin was slain in personal combat by Valdor, killed by the Apollonian spear that the Captain General had carried through every battle of the Unification era. The Valdor novel preserves a fragment of dialogue from the massacre. Valdor calls the new Astartes the future as he kills. The word the novel uses to describe his tone is grimly, one adverb. That's the entire canonical record of what this cost the Captain General, a single word suggesting something heavier than clinical efficiency, without specifying what that weight actually was. Whether Valdor felt anything resembling grief, whether the execution of the soldiers his emperor created before him registered as something other than necessary action, the lore does not say. Grimly is all that's confirmed. Another fragment from the novel preserves Valdor's voice addressing a Thunder Warrior in the killing field. The tone is cold. Whether that coldness was armor over grief, or simply the voice of a man who had resolved something in himself before arriving at Mount Ararat, the text doesn't specify. The lore preserves two contradictory accounts of whether the Thunder Warriors understood what was happening. One version holds that the realization came only as the killing began, that the soldiers who assembled at Mount Ararat believed they were there for a final campaign and discovered the truth at the end of a spear. The second account states that some among the Thunder Warriors had recognized, even before the Unification Wars concluded, that their creator had built short lifespans into them, that he had cursed them in the act of making them, and that a portion of them turned against him in rage before the purge was completed. Both versions exist in the canon. The lore does not resolve them into a single, clean account, because the historical record, even the historical record of a fictional universe, rarely resolves into a single, clean account. The official imperial history chose a third version, constructed after the fact. In that account, the Thunder Warriors died heroically at Mount Ararat, fighting under the warrior Eric Tyrannus in a final sacrifice for the Emperor's vision. That narrative was maintained without serious challenge for more than 10,000 years. The truth was, as the sources note, skillfully concealed from the people of the Imperium for the entire duration of the Imperium's existence up to the 41st millennium. Eric Tyrannus, reportedly, survived. He and a handful of other Thunder Warriors escaped into Terra's hive cities, became criminal overlords across years of operating in the urban sprawl of humanity's birthworld. The loyal soldiers of the Emperor's First Army ended their days running organized crime operations because the heroes' deaths written for them in the official record weren't extended to them in reality. Their history had been replaced. The men who survived the replacement had no place in the story that replaced them. The Emperor's moral calculus at Mount Ararat isn't straightforwardly villainous, and the lore doesn't present it as such. The metabolic collapse was real. The mental instability was real. A force of psychologically deteriorating super soldiers in a post-unification political environment represents a genuine catastrophic liability. Soldiers with the capability of thunder warriors and without the stability to follow orders or hold their biological integrity together are a danger to everything the unification wars were supposed to build. Eliminating them at the moment of victory, before the deterioration progressed further, was a decision with brutal internal logic. But the Emperor built the deterioration into them from the beginning. He understood adult augmentation's biological cost when he designed the process. He created a generation of loyal soldiers with the structural guarantee of eventual breakdown, and then used that breakdown as the justification for their elimination at the moment of his choosing. These aren't the actions of someone who was caught off guard by what his soldiers became. This is someone who knew what he was creating, why it was finite, and when its finitude would become useful. The most intelligent being in human history, making soldiers who would one day provide a reason to destroy them. The Custodians carried out the order. The Companions, the men built specifically to know the Emperor as a person, to understand his thinking at the level required for genuine counsel, watched their creator destroy the men who trusted him first, executed the command through their Captain General's spear hand, and remained at the Emperor's side when the battle at Mount Ararat was over. They had now seen what he was willing to do to the soldiers who served him loyally when those soldiers became inconvenient. They saw it through Valdor. They stayed anyway. This isn't blind obedience. It can't be, given what the Custodians are built to be. They are engineered to understand, not simply to comply. The Custodians stayed at Mount Ararat's conclusion because they knew something about the Emperor that no one else in his service was positioned to know. They understood the full scope of what he was trying to accomplish, the weight of what unification of humanity actually required, the genuinely terrible logic of why the Thunder Warriors had to be removed when they did. They disagreed with nothing in the calculation, perhaps, or they disagreed with everything and stayed anyway because the alternative, abandoning the project, walking away from the only person they were built to be loyal to, was simply not a possibility their existence had equipped them to choose. The tragedy of Mount Ararat isn't that the Custodians were deceived about who they served. It's that they weren't. 2 centuries of Great Crusade follow. The 10,000 guard the Emperor in his sanctum on Terra, while the Primarchs carry the legions across the galaxy, adding world after world to the growing Imperium. The Custodians accumulate their years of proximity, his assessments of the sons who are progressing and the ones who are beginning to unsettle him, the private architecture of a plan that requires keeping critical knowledge from the people nominally leading his military, the slow accumulation of everything that can go wrong when the most important secrets are held by one person. They watch the Primarchs reach toward their father and find a man who is always occupied with something larger than any of them. They watch the imperial truth, the explicit rejection of religion and superstition as the intellectual foundation of the Great Crusade, begin to develop the kind of cracks that come from applying a human-scale philosophy to a galactic-scale project. They watch him not tell his sons about chaos. The War Master, Horus Lupercal, first Primarch, the most favored and the most trusted, given command of the entire Great Crusade in the Emperor's name, is never told about the fundamental nature of the threat his father is actually fighting. Horus governs the crusade without this knowledge. He makes decisions without it. When the corruption reaches him on the moon Davin in 005.M31, he has no framework for recognizing what is being done to him. The information that might have protected him was kept from him by the man he was supposed to trust with his life. The Custodians know things the Primarchs don't. Their proximity, their purpose, their design as people capable of receiving and holding the Emperor's actual thinking rather than the version of it he distributed for public consumption. These are the qualities that put them in a different category of access. What they did with that access, what they understood about the gathering catastrophe, what they saw coming before it arrived, the lore leaves largely unexplored. But they were there, in the innermost sanctum, when the signals were accumulating. Then comes the Siege of Terra. Horus, now fully corrupted, brings half the Space Marine legions against the planet, 9 legions of traitors against 9 loyalists, plus the forces of the solar system itself. The siege lasts for years. The lore's timeline places it across 014.M31, with the final assault grinding through the outer walls of the Imperial Palace itself. The Custodians fight. They are there for the defense of the walls, the corridors, the inner sanctum. They bleed for every meter of Imperial Palace that the traitors threaten. And then the Emperor makes a decision. Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, hangs in orbit above the burning planet. The Emperor decides to go to him, to meet the catastrophe directly, to end it in the way that only the Emperor himself can end it, in personal confrontation with the being his son has become. He teleports aboard the Vengeful Spirit. The Custodians aren't with him at the moment it mattered most. Whether they couldn't follow him there, whether he chose to go without them, whether the nature of what waited aboard the Vengeful Spirit was something he determined he had to face alone, the result is the same. He went somewhere they couldn't protect him, to confront something they couldn't stand between him and. What came back was placed on the Golden Throne. The Golden Throne is the vast life-sustaining mechanism beneath the Imperial Palace, originally constructed for a different purpose, repurposed in the emergency of the Emperor's condition to maintain the stasis that prevents him from dying entirely. It requires 1,000 psychers sacrificed daily simply to sustain the machinery that keeps his broken body from final dissolution. Since the day he was placed within it, he hasn't spoken. The consciousness that held centuries of daily discourse with the people he built to know him has gone somewhere the Custodians can't follow, into a silence that has now lasted more than 10,000 years. For 10,000 years, from the close of the Horus Heresy in approximately the early 31st millennium to the events of the 41st millennium in which the current game setting is framed, the Adeptus Custodes have stood vigil over that machine. The Companions became the Watchers. The men created for the specific purpose of knowing the Emperor as a present, speaking, responsive person now maintain an endless guard over something that can't know them back. Every element of their design, the noble Terran birth, the Emperor's personal involvement in their making, the philosophical and intellectual range engineered into them from infancy, the centuries of accumulated proximity to who he was as a person, was built to enable a relationship that will never occur again. They were made for companionship. What they received, for 10,000 years and counting, is the inability to stop standing next to the space where the relationship used to be. The failure isn't military. The Custodians fought in the Siege of Terra. They were at the walls. They were in the corridors. The catastrophe wasn't produced by their inadequacy as soldiers. It was produced by the Emperor choosing a confrontation they couldn't share, for reasons only he fully understood, against a threat that decades of secrecy about the nature of chaos had allowed to develop to exactly this scale. The failure is personal, and it's the failure of the only people in the universe built specifically to prevent it. They existed to protect him. The one time their protection mattered most, they weren't there. What it means to stand vigil for 10,000 years over a man who can no longer receive the vigil. That's the weight the lore built into the Custodians across 40 years of canonical development. Every other faction grieves a god or obeys an icon. Only the Custodians are grieving a specific person they actually knew. Only the Custodians know what was actually lost in the moment the Golden Throne became his permanent residence, because only the Custodians knew him well enough to understand the size of what the Golden Throne has replaced. Now, the 2024 Retcon. What Games Workshop changed, how they changed it, and why the lore community's objection is a lore argument rather than anything else. The official Games Workshop statement was published on the Warhammer community website in an article titled, New Custodes, Your Questions Answered. The key line, all Custodes, male or female, embody the pinnacle of the genetic and cellular engineering the Emperor employed when creating his armies. Female Custodians, official, retroactively canonical, presented not as an introduction to the faction, but as a correction to prior depiction. The first publication to introduce a female custodian was identified by hobby analysis sources including Merlin's Miniatures as a Black Library short story titled The Tides. The 10th edition Adeptus Custodes Codex followed, with Goonhammer's review of that codex recording the moment with documentary precision. Our first honest-to-goodness, actual factual female member of the Custodian Guard in a Games Workshop publication. Not presented as an addition to the faction's story, presented as something that was already there, simply not previously depicted. Always been there. The sarcastic quotation marks in this video's title are doing specific work. They mirror the phrasing that appeared repeatedly in community discussion following the announcement, a phrase that a specific kind of 40K fan recognized as claiming continuity with a lore record that explicitly said otherwise. The canonical record that said otherwise isn't ambiguous. The 8th edition standalone Adeptus Custodes Codex, the faction's first dedicated rulebook, the primary lore text that established the Custodians as a distinct, fully developed faction in game terms, described the creation process in explicit and consistent language. The most cited formulation, preserved across community discussion following the retcon announcement. It's known that all Custodians begin their lives as the infant sons of the noble houses of Terra. The community preserved that phrasing with the word sons emphasized in online reproduction, specifically to flag how explicit the prior text was. The Bolter and Chainsword Forum's comprehensive historical record of Custodes lore notes that from the earliest days of the Custodes' existence, aspirants to their order were recruited from the infant sons of the Terran nobility. That language ran consistently through pre-2024 publications. Sons of the Emperor, infant sons of the Terran nobility, the male framing consistent across lore and creation sections of the relevant codices. Pre-10th edition, they were all male. Now they're not, and apparently never were, even though every piece of pre-10th lore or artwork states otherwise. One additional detail documented in community reading of the Warhammer community article warrants mention. A reader noted that the article also described Custodians as no longer being exclusively recruited from Terra or from noble birth. If accurate, the retcon didn't add female Custodians alongside the prior creation framework. It revised the noble birth requirement and the Terran origin requirement at the same time. 3 foundational elements of the creation description, male sex, noble birth, Terran origin, apparently revised simultaneously in one document without acknowledgement that any of them had been explicitly stated in prior canonical text. The always been there framing forecloses the question the prior lore raises. It answers, what did the earlier codex say, and what are we changing? With, nothing was changed, this was always true. That framing treats 4 decades of consistent male-only depiction and explicit creation lore as a gap in representation rather than a deliberate creative choice that carried structural meaning. It answers the wrong question. The right question, and the one the lore community keeps returning to, is whether those foundational elements of the creation description were load-bearing architecture. The answer, built across everything in this video, is yes. The noble Terran birth requirement isn't flavor. It's the mechanism that makes the companion relationship possible, the reason the transformation produces people capable of knowing the Emperor rather than soldiers capable of serving him. Remove it, and the Custodians stop being a distinct category of creation and become superior Astartes. The Terran origin isn't geographic tradition. It places the Emperor's companions in immediate personal proximity to the world he's been shaping for millennia, in the social formation most capable of producing genuine intellectual equals. The male framing, consistent from the faction's founding lore onward, was part of the specific architectural description of what a custodian is, not an illustration of who might become one under different circumstances, but the canonical text of how the process works. 40 years of that description, one retroactive revision, presented as a correction rather than a change, with no engagement with what the prior description said or why it said it. The community naming this a retcon is accurate by any functional definition of the term. The Warhammer 40,000 wiki was updated to describe the Custodes as an elite cadre of genetically engineered transhuman male and female warriors. The prior text described something more specific and more architecturally meaningful than transhuman warriors. The update replaced that specificity with a more general description that accommodates the new inclusion without explaining what happened to the old one. The Adeptus Custodes stand vigil over a friend they couldn't save in a body that can no longer speak to them for 10,000 years and counting. Every other faction in Warhammer 40,000 is grieving a god or obeying a symbol or serving an institution that has long since outgrown anyone's intention. Only the Custodians are personally lonely. Only they experience the actual relationship, 2 centuries of proximity, daily knowledge of who this man was as a person, the full weight of understanding him completely, including the parts that implicate them, and then watched it become inaccessible on a specific day in the 31st millennium. The lore built that loneliness carefully. The noble houses of Terra, the infant sons offered to a process that remade them from the foundational material up. The Emperor's personal involvement in each making, the philosophical and intellectual depth engineered into them so that the people standing next to the most singular mind in human history could actually stand next to it as something other than an audience. The Heteron Guard, named for Alexander's companions, Valdor's single described adverb of grimness at Mount Ararat, the only confirmation that carrying out the Emperor's darkest orders registered as something beyond duty. The 10,000-year vigil as the only form of loyalty available when the person you were made to be loyal to can no longer receive it. That architecture is what the retcon touched, not the armor profiles, not the kill statistics. The specific lore that explained why this faction's grief is unique, why their vigil is personally devastating in a way no other faction's devotion can be, why they are the only people in the 41st millennium who actually know what was lost the day the Golden Throne became the Emperor's permanent residence. They failed at the one thing they existed to do, and they have been standing next to that failure in silent golden witness for 10,000 years. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one.